Okay, I'm going to tell you a story about a special man. And you know, today we think about freedom. Just a few weeks ago, we celebrated the 75th anniversary of D-Day. This special person played a very special role in my life. Outside my two parents, he probably influenced my early childhood more than anybody else. He was a godly man, and one of the reasons he was a godly man is because of the story that I'm about to tell you. I went to church with him. In fact, we were baptized. We became Christians at the same time. And we spent probably around the table like this once a week, and our two families. So he was a very special person. And he was my uncle, William P. Mayberry. We called him Paul. Now, when I tell you that he was my uncle, I want you to think in terms of your uncle. For example, Zach, you can think of Uncle Ricky or Uncle Leon and how your relationship with those two gentlemen are. Or Christina, Deanna, you can think of Uncle Randall, how close you are to him. And so had a very special relationship. Now, what makes this story pertinent for today is that he was a prisoner of war in World War II. And I want to tell you about that story. I knew that he was a prisoner of war all my life, but I never talked to him about it. And he didn't talk about it. He didn't want to talk about it. So he was getting up around 80 years old, and so I said, I want to talk to him about it. So I got a little scheme together, and I called him up, and I said, I got 3 grandkids that I want you to tell the story to. And you guys were little. I don't even know if you remember going to visit Paul, but I took the 3 of you, and we just sat down with Paul.
Is he had the dude with the gun?
Huh?
Was he the dude that was sat on his porch with the gun?
Airsoft gun on his hip, or on
What?
his
He had a
airsoft
gun
gun.
on his lap or something? And he was sitting in a rocking chair?
He was sitting in the rock, but I don't know if he had a gun or not. But anyway, this was around 2000, so y'all were small. Do you remember?
I think I remember it, yeah.
Do you remember it?
I think I do. I'm telling you, I think he had a gun.
Football.
I think.
Well, so I asked him to tell y'all his story, and he did. And I made the mistake of not recording it. So I decided the next time I was going up there, I was going to record it. So I did record my next visit with him. I went up there with your grandpa and with your dad and with Uncle Randall. And so he told us his experience about being a prisoner of war. And when he was mentioning in detail, he talked about a forced march. And I never heard about a forced march. Didn't know anything about it, but it kind of just piqued my interest. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the degrading experience about that forced march. But first of all, let me just bring you up to date and tell how he became a prisoner of war. He enlisted in 1942, and he was in the Air Force, and he was a gunner on a B-17 bomber. Now, a B-17 bomber had 10 personnel. You had a pilot, co-pilot, radio man, navigator, and bombardier. Primary purpose was to drop bombs on targets. And then there were 5 gunners. There was 2 waist gunners, a top gunner, a tail gunner, and then a gunner, what they call a ball turret. It swiveled, and it was right on the bottom, okay? So you had 5 gunners. Okay, they sent out on October 13, 1945. He went out on his 48th mission. This was going to be his last mission before he got leave to go home. 48th mission. Well, as soon as they dropped the bombs over Vienna, immediately they were shot at, and the plane was shot up badly. One of the engines was smoking, and so they knew that they were going to have to make a crash landing. Now, some of the guys bailed out on parachutes, but Paul stayed with the plane, and the reason he stayed with the plane was that the gunner in the ball turret, had been wounded. And they knew if they didn't get him out of that ball turret, when the plane landed on the ground, he would be crushed to death. So Paul and another guy worked to get him out, and he said that he barely got him out just in time, right before the plane hit the ground and the crash landed, and they got the guy out and saved him. But they had been shot down, and they had drifted down into Hungary. That's where the crash landed, in a field. As soon as they got out of the plane, they were surrounded by civilian farmers. He said they had pitchforks, and garden tools. And Paul, he made this specific comment. He said, well, I just figured we was a goner. And I had brought me a little food, so I just sat down and ate my food. And then shortly thereafter, the German prisoners came and took him to a prison camp. Now, this prison camp was in Poland. It is documented on his Army records. It was Stalag 4. Remember that. Stalag 4. It was in Poland, Gross Tacho or something like that. And so this is important to remember, because when Paul was talking about he was on a forced march, I started doing research. What was he talking about? And you can Google this. It's either the march, forced march, the black march, the death march. But what happened? This was on February the 6th, 1945. Russia was invading Poland from the east. They were now about 15 miles from this prison camp. Hitler did not want the prisoners to be saved, because he wanted to use the prisoners for bargaining chips later on. So he demanded that this camp be evacuated. Stalag 4. There was about 10,000 prisoners there. It was in the dead of winter. It was 10 degrees below zero. Snowing outside. They were told to get prepared to march. They thought they were only going to be marching a couple of days. This right here is a picture of a group. And I'll pass that around. That shows how they were dressed. They had big overcoats, they had a blanket. The Red Cross had given them a package of food, which would last them a couple of days. And so here they start out on this march. And it ended up, they were forced to march in this deplorable weather, almost 800 miles. In a couple of days, their food ran out. From then on, they had to scrounge around for their food. Now, while they were still in Poland, the guards were very cruel to them and pushed them along and wanted them to travel as fast as they could, because The Germans knew if the Russians caught up with them, they'd kill them on the spot, the guards, with prisoners. So they, out of just self-preservation, they were pushing these soldiers along. And I want to read just this little paragraph to describe to you what the conditions were. Okay, listen to this. This is just a paragraph. Now, this book is called The Last Escape. This is testimony after the war of prisoners of war that were in this forced march. And they give their testimony and the conditions. And I had known that Paul almost starved to death, and he lost about a third of his weight, but I didn't know any of the details, okay? But it's all described in this book of what these guys went through. But listen to this. Okay, they were being forced along at a pretty fast pace, westward into the sunset, going between 35 to 50 kilometers a day, with no stops allowed for personal comfort. We had to urinate as we walked. Those who dysentery had to soil themselves. Pretty soon, no one had any shame about this. If they were passing through a village and you had to have a bowel movement, you just dropped your trousers and crapped in the street gutter. Out in the country, we were not even allowed to drop out. We just had to do it in our underwear and keep going. We also weren't allowed to stop to drink of water. So all we could do was reach down and get a handful of snow and stuff in our mouths. But the people who had gone before us had soiled in the snow, relieving themselves where they walked because they had no other options. We were just passing the disease from one person to another. Paul described that that lots of times they were able to sleep in barns, and then they had to scrounge for their food. He told us one example. They found this bunch of peas, and so they boiled the peas, and when they boiled the peas, the bugs came up to the top. And they said, that was just a blessing. They ate the peas, ate the bugs, and were thankful for the bugs. And, so they left February the 6th. They got to Wobbling concentration camp late in March. Now it's documented that he was in prison at Stalag 4. He was transferred to Wobbling, and then he was liberated at Moosburg. Now, I want to show you this map. I don't know if you can see, this is right here, Stalag 4. And I've got it, little arrows. Right along here was Wobbling camp. And then all the way down here in southern Germany was Moosburg. So they were forced marched from here all the way, and that's about 800 miles. And they almost starved to death. Paul said they would have eaten anything. And it's documented in here with some of the things that they did eat. There were a lot of dogs missing. Even rats. They would eat anything. And I think the reason Paul never shared this information to any degree is that I think there was, he didn't want to remember this experience. And oh, by the way, your grandpa loved Paul. In fact, he gave him his first job in insurance and taught him all he knows about insurance. And if he was here today, he would validate that. But this is a map. Marcella, can you see the map?
Yes.
Okay. So, they only stay a couple of days in Warmland concentration camp, and then they force march him again down to Moosburg, which is in southern Germany. And then on April 29th, the camp was liberated by General Patton. And he comes strolling up in his Jeep. And Paul says he had those two crystal, or what do you call, pearl handles on his hips, handle pistols on his hip. And he was a scrappy young man. And he said they went berserk. Some got on the rooftops hollering. The guards, right before Patton and them show up, they take off and leave. And so they're liberated by General Patton in the Third Army. And this was on April 29th, 1945. And he was skin and bones. In fact, they took him to a hospital, and he recuperated. And to this very day, not to this very day, because he died about 15 years ago, just a couple of years after you guys got to see him. But for all the time that I knew him, he always had a room filled with canned goods and food. Because he said he never wanted to go hungry again. And he had this fear of being hungry. And so this is one example of the cost of freedom. And I think it's appropriate that we, as we think about the freedom and the cost of our freedom, I know we think of being freed from the British in 1776, and there was a lot of brave men during that period who fought for our freedom and for our independence. But there's been other times that men and women, but our ancestors have had to face extreme difficulties to preserve our freedom. And Hitler and they were a formidable foe, and they had already taken over Europe. They would have surely taken over Britain without the Americans coming to their rescue. And so that's a story of sacrifice that's in our family, and I've asked Marcella to record this because I want us as a family to remember this story and reflect upon it as we think of the sacrifice that people before us have paid for this freedom. And so William P. Mayberry, this is his picture when he was, just pass that around, that's his picture. Paul P. Mayberry. And that's a story of sacrifice that from our family. So, end the story!